Imagine this. A ship, the most opulent vessel mankind had ever built, cutting through the Atlantic night. The year, 1912. The world called it unsinkable. A floating palace of steel, brass, velvet, and champagne. But beneath the music of waltzes and the clink of crystal glasses, something far darker breathed through its iron bones, something almost no passenger ever knew existed. If you dare to face the truth behind this story, hit that subscribe button now and press the bell icon, because the next revelation should reach you before anyone else. You see, the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a vessel of secrets. The iceberg may have claimed its body, but what the ocean truly swallowed was something else, an experiment. A hidden chamber, buried deep below the passenger decks, where science was bent into heresy and men in starched white coats whispered promises that civilization was not ready to hear. Most people think of the Titanic only in terms of tragedy. Thousands dead, a cautionary tale of arrogance. But what if I told you the disaster was not just fate, not just human error, but a carefully orchestrated silencing? That somewhere in its drowned corridors lay the evidence of a forbidden project, an echo of a laboratory whose existence was denied, scrubbed from every record, because what they were doing threatened to unravel the very structure of control that has ruled mankind for centuries. Now lean closer, because this is not a bedtime story. This is dangerous knowledge, the kind of truth that men have killed to protect, the kind of truth that was buried under 2 miles of crushing water pressure so that it would never resurface. But it has. And if you're still watching this, if your pulse hasn't already told you to turn away, then you are stepping into that truth. The Titanic's laboratory was no myth. Survivors whispered of corridors they were forbidden to enter, guarded by crew who weren't listed on any manifest. Men who never smiled, never drank, never even mingled with their own. Passengers reported strange vibrations in the night, like a pulse radiating through the steel, a heartbeat not belonging to any engine. And in the days before the ship sank, some swore they saw light, an unnatural bluish glow seeping through cracks in the floorboards of the cargo deck. Of course, official history erases these accounts. The survivors who spoke of it were dismissed as delirious, their words buried under trauma. But trauma doesn't explain the missing cargo records. Trauma doesn't explain the sealed crates with no names. Trauma doesn't explain why certain elite passengers, financiers, industrialists, and politicians boarded the Titanic not to arrive in New York, but to make sure something, or someone, never did. And tonight, I'm going to show you what the Atlantic has been hiding for over a century. They told the world the Titanic was carrying coal, food, and the belongings of the wealthy, but buried in the ship's cargo manifest, hidden among the trunks of silks and cases of champagne, were crates that no customs officer was ever supposed to inspect. They were marked only with an alchemical sigil, a strange interlocking circle and triangle, a symbol that does not belong to any shipping company, but to an older brotherhood, one that has guided the hand of kings and financiers for centuries. These crates, according to the few whispers that survived, contained apparatus for a private laboratory hidden in the ship's bowels. Coils of copper tubing, glass vessels shaped like lungs, powders that shimmered unnaturally under gaslight, and a device that one survivor later described, before vanishing from all public record, as a machine that hummed with the sound of voices not from this world. The laboratory, secured behind steel doors below the third-class cabins, was staffed by a small team of men brought aboard under false identities. They were not sailors, nor engineers, nor even stewards. They answered only to the financiers who backed the voyage, and their task was simple but sinister: to test whether human consciousness itself could be fractured, manipulated, and remade aboard a ship that would never be questioned, because no one imagined secrets could be hidden within a pleasure liner. The Titanic became more than transport. It became a floating temple of psychological experimentation, and the passengers were the unwitting congregation. Imagine walking down a corridor lined with velvet wallpaper, unaware that just a few floors below, someone was running currents through the skull of an immigrant laborer, paid a handful of coins to volunteer, recording the way his eyes changed, the way his memory failed, the way his fear could be sharpened into obedience. The hum of that hidden machinery, survivors claimed, was not the sound of pistons. It was the sound of will itself being broken. But history does not record these experiments. History tells you of lifeboats and wireless signals, of brave men and drowned lovers, while the truth sleeps at the bottom of the Atlantic. And I tell you now, the iceberg was no accident. The collision was a cleansing fire, an execution of knowledge too volatile to reach American shores. Because if those crates had been unpacked in New York, if the laboratory had been established on land, the balance of power in the 20th century would have shifted overnight. Nations would fall, empires would rise, and the man you believe yourself to be would never have existed. Think of the men who financed this voyage, the same names etched into your history books as titans of industry, philanthropists, and visionaries. But behind their portraits in gold frames, they were predators circling the same secret: control over the human mind. You've heard of steel barons, oil kings, and railroad emperors, but what they craved was not just wealth, it was ownership of thought itself. That laboratory was their wager, their gamble to seize a power older than governments and more enduring than armies. And aboard the Titanic, safe among luxury and music, they believed no one would notice the experiment unfolding in the dark. Witnesses spoke of steerage passengers disappearing for hours, ushered into off-limit compartments by men who carried no badges of rank. They returned pale, trembling, unable to explain where they had been, some muttering fragments of languages they had never spoken before, others weeping uncontrollably at invisible terrors only they could see. A few never returned at all, their absence explained away as drunken accidents or clandestine affairs. Yet their names are missing from the ship's final list of the dead, as if they had been erased before the iceberg ever came into view. Ask yourself, why would some of the wealthiest men in the world book passage together on the same vessel, a vessel carrying such secret cargo? Why did a handful of the richest cancel at the last minute, claiming illness or urgent business, their excuses as rehearsed as a theater script? Why was the Titanic's wireless operator receiving coded messages days before the collision, messages that were later scrubbed from every official archive? Because the ship was not meant to complete its journey. It was meant to disappear, laboratory, evidence, and witnesses swallowed whole, leaving only a legend of arrogance against nature. But arrogance was not the sin. The sin was ambition too dark to confess that on the open Atlantic, far from governments, churches, or the press, they were reaching into the mind like a thief slips into a house at night. They believed they could bend thought itself, break memory, even capture the essence of fear like a mineral in a jar. And when the iceberg ripped open the hull, it was not only iron and wood that drowned, it was a secret so terrible that even now, more than a century later, whispers of it are enough to silence men who know too much. The architects of this hidden research were not nameless shadows, they were the same dynasties whose fingerprints still press against your life today. Families who sit behind banks and governments, who write the rules of war and peace, while you believe those choices are random, chaotic, or democratic. The Titanic was their chessboard, and the laboratory beneath its decks was their first attempt to weaponize psychology not for healing, not for science, but for dominion. Documents unearthed decades later, quietly buried again before the public could see them, hinted at the involvement of men tied to secret lodges in London, Paris, and Boston. These lodges did not worship gold or steel. They worshipped control, the ability to turn human beings into predictable instruments. Imagine men sipping brandy in walnut-paneled rooms, speaking not of ships and trade routes, but of frequencies that could dull the will, of rituals that could erase memory, of techniques that could program obedience into flesh like a blacksmith forges steel. And on the Titanic, within those sealed compartments, these theories were not being discussed. They were being tested. Why else was the cargo manifest altered, listing meaningless items like machinery parts and medical supplies, where witnesses remembered coffin-shaped crates escorted by guards who never removed their gloves? Why else did certain scientists vanish from European universities in the months before the voyage? Men whose reputations were suddenly smeared as frauds only to resurface in rumors of secret passage to America? The Titanic was no accident. It was a vessel chosen because its destruction could erase both experiment and experimenter. Think, the ship set sail with some of the world's richest and most influential men aboard, yet it carried no spotlighted journalists, no investigative observers. It was a closed theater, a stage for a rite, wall in which the audience, the public, was never invited, only shown the final act, a great ship shattered by ice, a nation mourning, a cautionary tale. And yet buried beneath the official tragedy was the truth, an early prototype of institutional control, the same methods that would later surface in military barracks, in asylums, in propaganda halls, in the laboratories of intelligence agencies you still fear today. The Titanic's lost laboratory was the seed, and every manipulation you have ever seen, the way nations steer opinion, the way institutions manufacture fear, sprouted from the soil of that drowned experiment. The chain does not break at the bottom of the ocean. It resurfaces quietly, invisibly, in projects you have only heard whispers about, names spoken like rumors because they were never meant to be spoken at all. What drowned in 1912 was not the idea of mind control, but only its first theater, its first rehearsal. The blueprints of that hidden laboratory, the notes, the instruments, the very philosophy of breaking and remaking the human psyche were not lost to the sea. They were preserved, carried by men who survived because they were never meant to die. Within a generation, the same principles began to emerge again, this time dressed in the language of psychology and national security. You have heard the word Tavistock, perhaps dismissed it as conspiracy. But Tavistock was the polished continuation of what had been crudely tested in the Titanic's hold. It was there, in England, that social engineers began experimenting not on a handful of passengers in the dark of a ship, but on entire populations, measuring fear during bombings, mapping the breaking points of civilians under sustained psychological pressure, refining the same techniques that the Titanic's doctors had clumsily begun. And then came America, where the methods metastasized into MK-Ultra, a program that pretended to explore the limits of human consciousness, but was, in reality, the grandchild of that drowned experiment. Drugs, hypnosis, electric pulses, all variations of the same forbidden formula. Dismantle the self, plant new patterns, create obedience. The Titanic was the genesis of the modern control state, the place where an idea that should have been buried was instead baptized in salt water and carried forward by the men who financed it. That is why survivors who spoke of the laboratory were discredited, silenced, or simply disappeared. That is why no textbooks tell you that the same families who owned the banks funding the Titanic were later the patrons of psychological institutions, military think tanks, and intelligence black sites. History is not a series of accidents. It is a script written in ink you were never meant to see, a script that begins with a ship hailed as unsinkable and ends with you living in a society where your thoughts, your fears, your very desires are not your own. And if you think this knowledge is only of the past, ask yourself, why does every new generation awaken to the same machinery of fear, the same cycles of obedience, as if an unseen conductor is still directing the music? The survivors who dared to speak of what they had seen in the hidden decks became living threats to the order that had orchestrated the Titanic's voyage, and their testimonies, fragmented, buried in private letters, diaries, and the odd newspaper interview that was quickly withdrawn, read like dispatches from another reality. One young Irish immigrant, rescued from a lifeboat half frozen and delirious, whispered to a nurse in New York that he had been dragged below by crewmen into a compartment filled with lightning in glass jars, where a man in a white coat pressed strange discs against his head until his memory blurred and his tongue spilled secrets he had never told a soul. A French governess, whose employer perished in the icy water, confided to a priest that she had seen blue light seeping from the cargo deck door, accompanied by what she swore was the sound of dozens of voices chanting in unison, though she knew no such choir existed aboard. Another, a stoker who worked the boilers, claimed that men he had eaten with just hours earlier vanished into restricted corridors and were never seen again, their names curiously absent from all official casualty reports. And yet, when these accounts surfaced, they were mocked, attributed to trauma, to hysteria, to hallucinations brought on by cold and grief. But consider this. Why would ordinary people, with no stake in inventing tales, fabricate the same consistent details? Blue light, voices, the sensation of electricity crawling beneath the skin. The more they spoke, the faster their stories disappeared. Some were paid off with quiet sums, others institutionalized as mad, still others found dead in circumstances polite society never questioned. The conspiracy was not to hide the iceberg, it was to bury the laboratory, to erase it from history before its echoes could spread. And yet, those echoes never stopped. They travel, through the minds of the few who survived, through families who wondered why their loved ones returned changed, haunted, broken. They surfaced in anonymous letters sent to editors, letters that vanished before publication. They bled into rumor, into the kind of folklore people dismiss at first, but that lingers because it has the taste of something too dangerous to be entirely false. Those testimonies, scattered like broken glass across decades, are the only fingerprints left of the laboratory's existence, and when pieced together, they form a map that leads us straight to the institutions still shaping your reality today. The silencing of those witnesses was not random. It was systematic, carried out by the very families whose fortunes rose untouched while thousands lay frozen in the Atlantic. You know their names, though history has lacquered them with respectability. Rothschild, Astor, Rockefeller, Morgan. These dynasties were not merely passengers on the tide of progress, they were its architects, engineers of a hidden order that demanded secrecy above all else. Take J.P. Morgan, who owned the very line that built the Titanic. He was scheduled to sail on her maiden voyage, but canceled at the last moment, retreating to Europe with an excuse so flimsy it barely disguised foreknowledge. And consider John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man aboard, a man who had publicly criticized the growing influence of central banks and secret cabals. He did not survive. His death conveniently removed a voice too wealthy and too independent to be controlled. Meanwhile, the laboratory's existence was obscured, financed through the same shadow networks that would later fund war machines, intelligence agencies, and propaganda houses. The method was always the same: control the narrative, erase dissent, and if necessary, drown it, whether in ocean water or in ridicule. Newspapers that hinted at irregularities were bought out or silenced. Journalists who pressed too far found themselves ruined, while the surviving families of those who had spoken were pressured into silence with money or threats. Even the official investigations into the sinking, one in Britain and one in America, were guided by the hands of men whose ties to these dynasties were as obvious as their polished cufflinks. They did not ask about the missing cargo crates. They did not record testimonies of strange lights or hidden corridors. They turned the Titanic into a parable of arrogance and bad luck, an opiate story designed to pacify the mass, and bury the deeper rot. The families that ensured this silence are the same ones that later steered the rise of mass media, creating the channels through which you would consume only the narratives they approved. They understood something crucial, that the laboratory on the Titanic had revealed. If you can fracture memory and guide perception, you can govern without resistance. And so they let the ship sink, not only to drown men, but to baptize an idea in secrecy, ensuring that no one would ever connect the icy Atlantic with the psychological chains still wrapped around your mind today. Those symbols on the crates, the interlocking circle and triangle, were not idle decorations, nor were they the marks of any shipping company. They were sigils, emblems drawn from currents far older than the 20th century, the language of hidden orders that believed knowledge itself was a form of ritual power. You see, what was happening aboard the Titanic was not merely science in the sterile sense. It was ritual disguised as research, alchemy dressed in lab coats. The financiers who bankrolled that laboratory understood that true control over the human psyche required more than electricity, more than chemicals, more than hypnosis. It required ceremony, symbolism, and the careful orchestration of fear in spaces designed to magnify it. Witnesses who spoke of hearing chants below deck, of seeing lights that pulsed like a living heartbeat, were not hallucinating. They were describing the deliberate marriage of occult ritual with emerging psychology. This is the hidden strand that official history dares not touch, that the same elites who constructed empires of steel and oil were also initiates in secret lodges, performing rites that blurred the boundary between religion, science, and domination. They did not view human beings as individuals with souls. They saw them as vessels, instruments that could be emptied and refilled, broken and reforged. And the Titanic, with its ornate architecture, its gilded halls above and sealed chambers below, was itself a temple, constructed not only to dazzle the public, but to serve as the stage for a grand initiation in psychological control. Ask yourself why the ship carried not only the wealthy, but also thousands of immigrants crammed into steerage, human material to be observed, tested, and sacrificed without consequence. Ask yourself why the very design of the ship mirrored esoteric blueprints, with its grand staircase descending like a ceremonial axis and its hidden decks functioning as crypts of secrecy. This was not coincidence. It was architecture with intent. The families who orchestrated this knew that ritual magnifies power, that a ship hailed as unsinkable would carry within it the symbolic weight of hubris punished, a myth ready to be imprinted on the collective mind. And when the ship sank, when the screams echoed across the frozen Atlantic, the ritual was complete. A mass trauma, a psychic scar carved into civilization itself, one that could be used to guide belief, obedience, and fear for generations. The laboratory did not just vanish. It was consecrated in water, and its principles became the hidden scripture of control. The sinking itself was not merely a disaster. It was a psychological experiment writ large upon the Western world, a ritual of mass trauma designed to see how an entire civilization could be reshaped by a single night of horror. Consider the timing. The early 20th century, when the industrial age had taught man to believe he was master of nature, when the great powers of Europe were arming for conflicts that would redraw the map of the globe. Into this arrogance came the Titanic, the unsinkable symbol of human triumph, and its destruction was not only a tragedy, but a lesson burned into the collective psyche, that no man, no empire, no invention could stand against forces greater than himself. But those forces were not ice and water alone. They were orchestrated from the shadows. The elites knew that if you shatter the confidence of a generation, you can mold what remains. Survivors were not the only subjects. Entire nations became participants. Newspapers carried not just reports, but carefully crafted narratives emphasizing hubris, punishment, and the fragility of progress. In living rooms across America and Europe, people whispered of the folly of challenging fate, absorbing the subtle message that power and safety belonged only to those who obeyed established authority. Trauma was harvested, magnified, and used to reset the psychological framework of millions. This was the true harvest of the Titanic. The laboratory below deck tested on individuals, but the sinking itself tested on society. and the results were profound. Within just 2 years, the same populations were marched into the killing fields of World War I, obedient to governments that promised safety and vengeance, their spirits already conditioned by the lesson of the ocean. Do you see it now? The ship was not only a graveyard, it was a classroom, a demonstration of how quickly humanity could be broken by spectacle, how a single orchestrated catastrophe could rewrite culture itself. The laboratory drowned, but its principles survived, and the proof of their success was not hidden in crates, but in the way millions accepted slaughter in trenches as inevitable, even righteous. The Titanic was the pilot program for a century of manipulation, the first great trauma machine, and ever since that night, the ruling families have known exactly how to manufacture fear, how to fracture identity, how to direct the soul of a people as if it were no more than a ship on dark waters. What began in the freezing Atlantic became a template, a blueprint that the hidden architects would return to again and again. Create the spectacle of tragedy, saturate the public mind with fear, then harvest obedience from the shock. The Titanic was only the first grand rehearsal of this model, and its success emboldened those who had designed it. Look at the sinking of the Lusitania just 3 years later, an event so conveniently timed and so perfectly manipulated in the press that it transformed a reluctant American public into willing participants in the bloodbath of World War I. Look at the engineered panic of the Great Depression, where millions were made to believe that collapse was a natural cycle of the market rather than the deliberate constriction of money by the very families who had tested obedience in the Titanic's wake. Look at Pearl Harbor, a trauma that shattered American isolation and summoned a wave of blind allegiance that carried a nation into global war. The same fingerprints appear at each disaster, advanced knowledge ignored, warnings silenced, survivors' irregular testimonies buried, and afterward a single, simplified narrative rolled out like scripture to ensure the masses asked no dangerous questions. And the pattern did not stop there. Over the decades, it only refined, becoming subtler, faster, more precise. In every generation there is a moment of rupture, an event that shocks the mind, freezes it in fear, and allows new structures of power to be built before the public has even begun to mourn. The laboratory on the Titanic was never about the individuals it tested in secret chambers. It was about proving that human memory, human fear, and human loyalty could be engineered on a vast scale through trauma. When you see skyscrapers fall, when you see markets crash, when you see sudden wars erupt with stories too neat to be true, you are watching the same ritual replayed, dressed in new costumes, but guided by the same ancient principle, that the mind, once broken by terror, will accept chains it would otherwise shatter. The Titanic was the seed, the iceberg its baptism, and the world you inhabit now, the world of headlines, crises, and invisible chains, is the harvest of that first experiment. In the digital age, the model has reached its most sophisticated form, no longer reliant on ships, bombs, or even the spectacle of war, because the battlefield is now your perception itself, the endless stream of images, headlines, and notifications that flow through your screens every waking hour. What began as crude experiments on a few hundred passengers, what evolved into world wars and staged catastrophes, has now been distilled into a system where trauma and control are administered in real time, silently, invisibly, through the very devices you cradle in your hands. Each breaking news alert, each viral image of disaster, each sudden wave of outrage or fear is the modern echo of the Titanic's screams across the Atlantic. Engineered ruptures in the psyche designed not to inform you, but to fracture you, to keep you in a permanent state of dread and dependency. The families who funded the laboratory beneath the Titanic's decks now sit behind the social networks, the media conglomerates, the data harvesters, and their experiment has matured. No longer must they sink ships to scar a generation when they can drip-feed catastrophe into your nervous system every day. ensuring that you never rise above the vibration of panic long enough to question the pattern. This is psychological warfare at planetary scale. Trauma not as isolated events, but as a continuous hum, a low-frequency current that reshapes how entire populations think, vote, work, and dream. You are not merely the descendant of the Titanic's experiment. You are still inside it, living in its perfected stage, where the laboratory has expanded to encompass the entire world, and the walls of its hidden chambers have become invisible, because they are built from fear, distraction, and the illusions you call information. The iceberg was never ice. It was always the test of how much terror it takes to steer the human's mind. And now, with the machinery of the digital age humming all around you, that test has become your daily reality, seamless, relentless, and nearly inescapable. Where this experiment is heading is no longer the mere management of obedience, but the complete rewriting of what it means to be human, the erasure of identity itself until the individual is nothing more than a programmable node in a global system. The laboratory that once pulsed beneath the Titanic's decks has metastasized into the infrastructures of artificial intelligence, biometric surveillance, genetic engineering, and neural interface technologies, tools that no longer simply measure behavior, but have the power to sculpt it at its root. Trauma alone is no longer sufficient. Now the goal is integration, merging the human nervous system with machinery of control so seamless that submission is not even recognized as submission. Already you see it in the way children are raised on screens that algorithmically tailor their desires, in the way data profiles predict decisions before you even know you've made them, in the way social credit systems creep into financial and governmental frameworks, turning survival into a matter of compliance. The families who tested electricity on the brains of the Titanic's captives have simply traded wires and scalpels for code and sensors, but the intent is unchanged. Strip the soul bare, erase memory of freedom, and inscribe a new operating system over the self. This is the end game hinted at in their symbols, the true ritual, transformation of humanity into a hive that cannot imagine dissent, cannot even recall what it once meant to be sovereign. You are witnessing the culmination of a century-long design, where catastrophe was merely the rehearsal and the digital cage is the finale. The Titanic was not only the birth of mass trauma engineering, it was the blueprint for a new species, one crafted not by nature or spirit, but by those who decided the human mind was clay to be molded, drowned, and remade in the image of control. The transhumanist agenda is not a futuristic dream whispered by idealists in laboratories. It is the direct descendant of the Titanic's hidden experiment, the culmination of a century-long project to break the human spirit and rebuild it in the image of power. What was once conducted in the shadows of a ship's sealed decks has now been draped in the seductive language of progress and innovation, promising liberation while delivering chains so refined they gleam like gifts. Neural implants, brain-computer interfaces, genetic editing, and synthetic biology are sold to you as cures for disease, enhancements for memory, solutions for climate and hunger. But behind the glossy promises lies the same intent as the blue-lit chambers beneath the Atlantic: to overwrite what it means to be human until identity, thought, even emotion itself is no longer sovereign but programmable. The elites no longer need to silence witnesses because the transformation is presented as voluntary, and millions will line up to surrender their minds, believing they are ascending when in truth they are stepping into a cage with walls too sleek to see. Trauma prepared you for this. Wars, disasters, pandemics, crises without end softened your will, fractured your trust, and taught you to cling to authority for safety. Now authority wears the mask of technology, and the laboratory has no walls because it is inside your body, your blood, your neurons. The Titanic was the prototype. The world wars, the scaling, the digital age, the refinement, and transhumanism, the harvest. Once the line between human and machine is erased, once consciousness itself is filtered through systems owned by the same dynasties who drowned their secrets in 1912, the final ritual will be complete. The birth of a species that no longer remembers it was ever free. A species remade as instruments of a power so ancient and so patient, it has been steering the course of history, one catastrophe at a time. The bloodlines steering this agenda today are not abstractions, not faceless corporations or nameless technocrats, but the same dynasties whose fingerprints were smudged across the Titanic's manifest, whose wealth shielded them from drowning while their rivals were dragged into the Atlantic. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Astor's remnants, and the offshoot families that intermarried into royalty and banking dynasties across Europe and America. These names have simply changed masks, trading steamships and steel mills for venture capital firms, philanthropic foundations, and think tanks that pretend to serve humanity while quietly drafting its replacement. They do not appear on television. They appear in boardrooms, at Davos, at Bilderberg, in the closed sessions where digital currencies, genetic patents, and biometric ID systems are signed into existence under the guise of progress. It is no accident that the very industries pushing neural implants, artificial intelligence governance, and global surveillance are funded by trusts and endowments seeded a century ago by those same families. Fortunes multiplied by war and disaster, then laundered into public good organizations that dictate what research is allowed, what medicine is approved, what information flows through the veins of society. They have refined invisibility into an art, teaching you to look at presidents, CEOs, and celebrities as if they are in command, when in truth they are no more than actors on a stage built by these bloodlines. The laboratory that drowned with the Titanic did not die. It was simply moved into universities, intelligence agencies, and corporate research parks, its spirit preserved by heirs who understood the ritual of trauma and carried it forward into every new generation. And now, as they steer humanity toward the merger of flesh and machine, toward a world where sikabati, adbo-tun, currency, identity, and thought itself are mediated through systems they own, their lineage is completing what it began, the slow, deliberate replacement of humanity with a designed species. Obedient, trackable, programmable. The ship may have sunk, but its architects did not. They survived, multiplied, and still sit at the helm, guiding the vessel of civilization toward the iceberg they have prepared for this century. Beneath all the machinery of finance, war, and technology lies the truest layer of their design, a ritual war against the human soul itself, a campaign not merely to control bodies or shape societies, but to sever the eternal spark within each person from the awareness of its own origin. The bloodlines understand something most dismiss as superstition, that consciousness is not an accidental byproduct of biology, but a luminous essence, a divine inheritance that cannot be broken by chains or drowned by oceans unless it is deceived into surrender. Every stage of their project, from the terror on the Titanic to the trenches of Europe, from the burning cities of war to the constant hum of digital distraction, has been aimed at dulling this awareness, burying it beneath fear, addiction, and engineered desires. Trauma is their sacrament, because a traumatized soul folds inward, disconnects from its higher knowing, and becomes pliable. Technology is their liturgy, because once consciousness forgets its sovereignty, it will accept wires, codes, and implants as its new covenant. This is why their symbols echo across disasters, why occult sigils reappear in corporate logos and state emblems, because each catastrophe, each manipulation is not only political theater, but ritual magic, designed to harvest attention, belief, and faith away from the divine and into their machinery of control. To merge man with machine is not just to engineer efficiency, it is to replace the soul's authority with an artificial imitation, to create a counterfeit spirit that can be owned, monitored, and extinguished at will. They do not fear nations or armies. They fear the moment humanity remembers its inner fire, the truth that no dynasty can extinguish what is infinite. And so every iceberg, every war, every broadcasted disaster has been a spell, a ritual repetition of drowning the spark, keeping it submerged so long that generations forget it was ever there. The Titanic was the baptism of this ritual war, but the final battle is unfolding now as humanity is offered the shining promise of transcendence through technology, when in truth the offer is nothing more than the final attempt to trade the soul for a cage of circuits and light. This ritual war against the soul is not only waged in great disasters and global upheavals, but woven into the fabric of daily life, disguised as harmless entertainment, education, and culture, ensuring that the chains are worn lightly and even celebrated. From the earliest years, children are saturated with images and stories that teach them to laugh at truth, to mock the sacred, to idolize power, wealth, and synthetic beauty, training their minds to look outward for meaning rather than inward toward the eternal spark within. Education, once a path of awakening, has been systematically reshaped into indoctrination, where curiosity is stifled and conformity rewarded, where history is rewritten to erase the fingerprints of the hidden families and replace them with sanitized myths of progress. Culture itself has been weaponized, transformed into an endless stream of noise that distracts from silence, because silence is where the soul remembers. The music blaring through speakers, the films projected onto screens, the endless scroll of social feeds, all of it crafted to create a restless hunger that can never be satisfied, a constant state of craving that keeps the spirit tethered to the material and blind to its own depth. Even joy is commodified, turned into spectacle, so that laughter itself becomes a narcotic rather than a doorway to freedom. Through these means, the laboratory's experiment continues not as wires and electrodes, but as invisible conditioning, 1,000 tiny cuts that bleed the soul's memory of itself until it accepts the artificial as natural and the cage as home. The Titanic was the overt trauma, the shattering blow, but daily culture is the subtle hypnosis, the gentle lull that keeps entire populations asleep while the architects build their final structure around them. Yet beneath this noise, the soul still stirs, still resists, for no amount of programming can fully extinguish what is infinite, and it is in this resistance, quiet, forgotten but indestructible, that the possibility of breaking the cycle still lies. Despite the weight of centuries pressing down, despite the ceaseless rituals of trauma and the carefully constructed labyrinth of distraction, cracks are forming in their system, fissures through which light leaks and refuses to be contained. And it is within these openings that the possibility of awakening lies. The families believed that endless repetition of fear would render humanity permanently docile, that each generation raised in shadows would forget the fire within. But what they did not anticipate was that trauma does not only break, it also awakens. It shakes the soul from slumber, and in moments of extreme pressure, some discover strength and vision they never knew they had. Every war has produced rebels who questioned the script. Every disaster has birthed survivors whose testimony could not be fully silenced, and every new tool of control has been turned by some into an instrument of liberation. The very networks designed to cage perception have also become channels for truth to travel faster than censorship can suppress, and the same digital machinery meant to enslave has given rise to communities that pierce the veil and remember together. Even in culture, where distraction is the weapon of choice, there are cracks where authentic art, genuine laughter, and raw human connection bypass the programming and ignite something ancient in those who witness it. The architects mistake compliance for victory, but what they cannot calculate is the unpredictability of the soul once it remembers its own nature, once it realizes that the walls of the laboratory are illusions sustained only by belief. These cracks are not accidents, they are inevitabilities, because no cage, no matter how elaborate, can fully contain what is infinite. The Titanic was their first great rehearsal, but even then whispers survived. Survivors told truths that were ignored but not erased, and those whispers have grown louder with every passing decade. It is through these cracks, these whispers, that the spell begins to unravel. And it is in this unraveling that the hidden families face their greatest threat. Not revolt of armies or collapse of markets, but the quiet, unstoppable remembering of who we are. This remembering, once it sparks within even a single individual, spreads in ways the architects cannot control, because it does not move like their systems of propaganda or commerce, linear and predictable, but like fire leaping from ember to ember, invisible until suddenly entire forests are ablaze. When one person steps outside the ritual, when they refuse to be governed by fear or lulled by distraction, their presence alone becomes a signal, a living reminder that another way of being exists, and others around them begin to feel the echo of their own buried fire. Communities form not by design but by resonance, drawn together by shared intuition rather than orders, and in these gatherings the spell begins to dissolve, because connection without manipulation is itself an act of rebellion. The hidden families rely on isolation, on each soul believing it is alone, but when the veils lift and people find each other beyond the scripted narratives, their power diminishes, for no dynasty can withstand the truth once it is spoken aloud by many. Remembering does not require revolt in the streets or the collapse of governments. It requires individuals reclaiming their silence, their curiosity, their ability to discern what is real from what is manufactured, and in doing so, refusing to feed the machinery of control. The Titanic was engineered to drown voices and bury truth beneath cold water and fear, but the very fact that its story still haunts the collective imagination proves that memory cannot be drowned forever. Each generation that questions, that digs beneath the surface, that refuses to accept the official story, is already breaking the spell. This is how remembering spreads, not through force, not through conquest, but through the quiet, unstoppable awakening of countless souls who realize they were never passengers on a doomed ship, but infinite beings capable of steering their own destiny once they step outside the script. The hidden families feel this awakening like a tremor beneath their carefully constructed empire, and in their desperation they accelerate their plans, tightening control faster than ever before, hoping to force the digital cage shut before the cracks widen beyond repair. They push artificial intelligence into every corner of life, wrapping it in the language of convenience and safety, while behind the curtain it becomes a system of prediction and enforcement, mapping every thought, every preference, every impulse, until the possibility of deviation seems impossible. They flood the world with crises, overlapping disasters designed to exhaust the human spirit, because an exhausted population cannot organize, cannot remember, cannot resist. They accelerate financial collapse only to replace it with digital currencies tethered to identity systems, ensuring survival itself is conditioned on obedience. They seed the idea of merging with machines not as dystopia, but as destiny, packaging it in glossy campaigns and celebrity endorsements so the masses will beg for the change they once feared. The pandemic was their test run, the trial balloon for global compliance, and though cracks appeared even then, the families saw how quickly entire nations bowed when fear was administered in daily doses, and so they push harder now, knowing that time is not on their side. For all their centuries of patience, their ritual repetition, and their meticulous engineering, they know that the remembering moves in ways they cannot predict, and if too many awaken before the cage is sealed, the spell collapses, their bloodlines exposed not as gods steering history, but as frail humans clinging to power through deception. Their desperation is the clearest sign of their weakness, and their rush to complete the final stage is not evidence of strength, but of fear fear that the Titanic's legacy will not end with a world enslaved, but with a world that remembers it was being tested and chooses, at last, to refuse. The turning point will not come with trumpets or banners, nor will it be announced by leaders on screens, for it will not belong to governments, corporations, or even movements in the conventional sense. It will arrive quietly at first, in the hearts of individuals who decide, each in their own way, that they will no longer play the game written for them. It will look like people stepping out of fear, even when fear is the currency of survival, choosing to trust their own perception rather than the carefully packaged narratives fed to them. It will look like families reclaiming time from the endless scroll, neighbors gathering not out of necessity but out of genuine connection, communities rediscovering skills long dismissed as obsolete, growing food, making music, telling stories without mediation by screens. It will look like refusal, not in violent revolt but in steady, unshakable non-compliance, refusing to surrender sovereignty to digital IDs, refusing to reduce human life to algorithms, refusing to trade freedom for comfort. The hidden families depend on a collective hypnosis to maintain their power, but hypnosis breaks the moment enough people decide to wake, and once that decision ripples outward, no ritual, no algorithm, no catastrophe will be enough to reassert control. The turning point will come when humanity remembers that the power they fear in their rulers has always been an illusion projected onto them, and the true force, the eternal, indestructible spark, was within them all along, waiting to be recognized. At that moment, the legacy of the Titanic shifts from tragedy and trauma to revelation, for the great ship that was meant to baptize the world into submission instead becomes the symbol of the experiment that failed, the iceberg that cracked the plan, the drowned secret that rose again in memory to awaken those who were meant to forget. The turning point. Will come when humanity no longer sees itself as passengers on a vessel steered by hidden hands, but as sovereign navigators reclaiming the course of their own destiny. A liberated humanity would not be a utopia scripted in policy papers or imposed by new authorities, but a living tapestry woven from countless acts of remembrance, a world where the artificial scaffolding of control has crumbled because people no longer consent to hold it up, and in its place rises something organic, unpredictable, and alive. It would look like cities reimagined as communities rather than markets, where technology is used as a tool of service rather than surveillance, where food, energy, and knowledge are cultivated locally so no dynasty can choke the flow of life by seizing supply chains. It would look like education restored to its true form, not indoctrination, but awakening, where children are taught to listen to their own inner voice as deeply as they study the stars, and where curiosity is nurtured instead of crushed. It would look like art no longer commodified into distraction, but recognized as the language of the soul, the very medium through which collective memory heals itself. It would look like medicine unshackled from patents and profit, rooted again in the wisdom of the earth, the body, and the unseen energy that animates both. The boundaries the families built, between nations, between classes, between races, between faiths, would dissolve as people remember they were never separate to begin with, and cooperation would emerge not as ideology, but as instinct. Above all, it would feel different. The weight of invisible chains lifted, the constant hum of fear replaced by a stillness that allows joy to arise without permission. This is not fantasy. It is the natural state of humanity once the parasitic systems are withdrawn, once the ritual war on the soul is abandoned, once people reclaim the silence and fire that have been theirs all along. A liberated humanity would not march under banners declaring victory. It would simply live, breathe, and create in ways the hidden families cannot fathom, for their imagination has been bound for centuries by control, while ours, once free, is infinite. The collapse of the hidden families will not come as a cinematic overthrow with palaces stormed and dynasties dragged into the streets, but as the slow, inexorable evaporation of their power, once the collective ceases to believe in the spell that sustains it, for their empire is made not of stone and steel, but of perception, contracts, and consent. When people no longer fear their crises, no longer depend on their institutions for survival, and no longer accept their narratives as truth, the foundation beneath their centuries of dominion crumbles silently, leaving them exposed as ordinary beings clutching at illusions that no longer hold weight. Financial empires will wither first, for their currencies are nothing more than symbols whose value evaporates the moment humanity refuses to trade its energy for empty promises. The great trusts, endowments, and shadow corporations that once bent governments to their will stand as relics, as brittle as paper when the belief in their authority dissolves. Their technologies of control, digital surveillance, biometric IDs, predictive algorithms, will falter, not because they are dismantled from above, but because millions of awakened souls refuse to comply, finding ways around them, creating parallel systems rooted in trust and cooperation that render the machinery irrelevant. Spiritually, their rituals will collapse as well, for the harvest of fear and trauma they have fed upon will dry up when humanity ceases to give its attention and energy to orchestrated catastrophes, when the soul's fire is remembered and no longer transferable to their altars. They will lash out, as they already have, in desperation, tightening their grip, but in doing so, they will only reveal their own fragility, for the more visible their hand becomes, the weaker their illusion of omnipotence. And when at last their names are remembered not as divine rulers, but as frightened manipulators who tried to drown truth in oceans and blood, their power will vanish completely, dissolved by the one force they could never counterfeit, the awakening of a species that no longer consents to forget what it is. In the age after the collapse, when the memory of chains lingers only as a warning, the story of the Titanic and the hidden families will not be told as mere history, but as mythos, a parable of how humanity nearly lost itself and how it awakened instead. The Titanic will no longer be remembered only as a doomed ship that struck ice, but as the great symbol of the old world's arrogance and the secret empire's first grand ritual to baptize humanity into fear. Children will learn that its sinking was not simply an accident, but the opening act of a century-long spell, and yet they will also learn that even in that darkness, truth survived, carried forward by whispers that refused to die. The hidden families, once worshipped in silence and feared as gods of destiny, will be spoken of as cautionary figures, tragic in their hunger for control, who mistook domination for immortality, and in doing so revealed the limits of their own imagination. Their symbols, once stamped onto currencies and screens, will be studied as relics of sorcery that lost its hold, reminders of how power was once conjured through ritualized trauma, but ultimately broken by remembrance. And woven into this mythos will be the story of awakening, that humanity, though lulled and manipulated, rediscovered its sovereignty not through violence, but through the simple, unstoppable act of remembering what could never be destroyed. In songs, in stories, in gatherings around fire and screen alike, the Titanic will become not just a tale of loss, but a sacred marker. The iceberg transformed into a monument of resistance, the shipwreck into a warning and a promise that whenever power tries again to sever the soul from its source, the infinite spark within will rise, defy, and illuminate the path back to freedom. Thus the mythos will not glorify the fall of the hidden families, but celebrate the resilience of those who chose to awaken, ensuring that their children and their children's children never again mistake a cage for a home, nor a dynasty for a god. Even in the time of liberation, when the spell of the hidden families has been broken and the memory of their dominion lingers only as shadow, humanity must remain vigilant, for the danger of forgetting is eternal, and every age carries within it the seed of repetition. Liberation is not a permanent state secured once and for all, but a living choice renewed each day. For the forces that sought to enslave the soul were not only dynasties and rituals, but archetypes of hunger, fear, and control that can rise again if left unacknowledged. The mythos of the Titanic will serve not merely as triumph, but as reminder, a warning that arrogance and amnesia can recreate the very cage once dismantled. New generations, born into freedom, will not. New generations, born into freedom, will not feel the same weight of chains, and in their innocence they may wonder if the stories of the hidden families are nothing more than legends exaggerated by their ancestors, and it is in that doubt that the old patterns could attempt to return, whispering again in the language of comfort, progress, and safety. For this reason, the task of those who remember will not be to preserve history as a rigid archive, but to embody remembrance as living practice, teaching not only what happened, but why forgetting is the root of enslavement. They will remind their children that the most dangerous chains are the ones draped in gifts, that the most enduring cages are those mistaken for homes, and that vigilance is not fear, but love, the care of a people who refuse to surrender their sovereignty again. The Titanic mythos will therefore be retold not as a relic of sorrow, but as a mirror, an eternal story reminding each generation that the spell always begins with small compromises, with the seduction of convenience over freedom, with the surrender of discernment to authority. In the telling and retelling, the cycle of memory becomes the shield against repetition. For so long as the story is alive, the archetype of control can be seen for what it is and dissolved before it hardens into power again. Thus, liberation becomes not a single event, but an ongoing covenant between the past and the future, a living current of remembrance carried forward so that humanity never again mistakes the illusions of a few for the destiny of the many. From the cosmic perspective, the struggle of humanity against the hidden families is not an isolated drama confined to Earth, but a reflection of a greater pattern woven throughout the universe. For wherever consciousness takes form, the same forces appear, those that seek to liberate and expand, and those that seek to bind and control. The story of the Titanic, the rituals of trauma, the centuries of manipulation, and even the great awakening that follows are all expressions of this larger dance between remembrance and forgetting, between the infinite nature of the soul and the illusions that try to confine it. Just as stars are born, burn, collapse, and are reborn, so too does consciousness cycle through states of light and shadow, learning each time not merely how to survive, but how to recognize itself more fully. Humanity's ordeal is therefore not meaningless suffering, but initiation, a trial through which the species discovers its resilience and earns its place in a wider community of beings who have faced similar tests across worlds and ages. To remember here is to align not only with freedom on Earth, but with the greater current of creation itself, to step into resonance with civilizations beyond the veil who once endured their own versions of the Titanic and the hidden dynasties, and who now watch to see whether this small blue world will awaken and join them in the vast unfolding of cosmic memory. The collapse of the families is thus not only an earthly liberation, but a signal, a beacon to the wider universe that humanity has passed its trial, that it has chosen remembrance over forgetfulness, sovereignty over subjugation, life over illusion. In this way, the Titanic, once a ship of death and deception, becomes not only a myth for Earth, but a symbol recognized in the stars, a reminder that no matter how deep the waters of forgetting, the spark of truth will always rise again. Once humanity awakens and steps into remembrance, Earth itself transforms from what was once a prison planet into a beacon world, radiating a frequency that draws the attention of civilizations across the cosmos who have long waited for this moment. For a species that endured the weight of deception and still chose to awaken carries a wisdom no peaceful world could ever teach. Earth will become a place of convergence, not through conquest or technological dominance, but through resonance, a living archive of how consciousness can be bent, broken, and nearly drowned, yet rise again with greater strength. The same oceans that once swallowed the Titanic will shine as mirrors to the stars, signaling to others that the trial has been completed, that a people who were once enslaved by illusion have now remembered their sovereignty. Humanity's role will not be to dominate or evangelize, but to embody, to become living proof that even the deepest spells of forgetting can be broken, and in doing so, Earth will serve as a sanctuary for souls across the galaxy who themselves seek to heal from cycles of control. The hidden families, who once imagined themselves as the apex rulers of this world, will be remembered as the necessary adversaries in a greater cosmic initiation, their fall marking the moment when humanity took its place not as victim, but as participant in the vast, ongoing unfolding of creation. With remembrance as its foundation, Earth will no longer radiate fear and division into the universe, but will emanate a frequency of coherence, drawing alliances and exchanges not of domination, but of mutual evolution. In this way, the planet once known for its wars, its secrets, and its shipwrecks, becomes a lighthouse in the galactic sea, a place where the memory of freedom burns so brightly that no spell of forgetting can ever again cast its shadow upon the human spirit. As humanity heals and remembers, Earth herself begins to heal alongside, for the planet was never a passive stage upon which the drama unfolded, but a living being entangled in the same spell, carrying the scars of centuries of exploitation, extraction, and desecration that mirrored the enslavement of her people. The forests, long cut and burned to fuel the engines of empire, begin to regrow as humans relearn how to live in reciprocity rather than conquest, planting not just for profit, but for balance, listening again to the language of trees and rivers. The oceans, which once carried the Titanic and later absorbed the poisons of industry, are honored as living waters, cleansed not only by technology, but by reverence, as cultures across the world restore the rituals of respect that once kept their tides sacred. The air, once thick with smoke and electromagnetic noise, becomes lighter as humanity relinquishes its addiction to endless consumption, recognizing that breath itself is a covenant between body and planet. Even the scars of the hidden family's rituals, sites of trauma, places where blood and secrecy were bound into the earth, become sanctuaries of renewal as people return not to worship power, but to restore harmony, offering gratitude instead of fear. Just as the spell of control drained vitality from the human spirit, so too did it drain the earth, and just as memory returns to people, so too does memory return to the land, the soil remembering how to bear abundance without chemicals, the waters remembering how to flow without toxins, the skies remembering how to hold light unbroken. In this shared healing, humanity comes to see that liberation was never only about themselves, but about restoring the covenant with the world that carried them. For Earth was not the prison, but the partner, waiting all along for her children to awaken and walk again in balance with her. Daily life on a healed Earth would feel profoundly different, not in the sense of dazzling technologies or grand revolutions, but in the quiet rhythms of ordinary existence restored to harmony, for people would wake not to alarms and obligations imposed by systems of control, but to the natural flow of the sun, the seasons, and the needs of their communities. Food would come not from faceless corporations, but from soil tended by neighbors and families, rich with flavor and vitality, because it was grown in reciprocity with the land rather than drained by exploitation. Meals would once again be shared as sacred gatherings rather than hurried transactions. Work would cease to be a grind of survival and become an expression of creativity, each person offering their unique gift to the whole, not because they are coerced by wages or debt, but because contribution itself is joy when sovereignty is intact. Children would grow up not in rows of desks memorizing instructions, but in living environments of exploration, where they are guided to trust their intuition as much as their intellect, learning through play, art, nature, and genuine curiosity. Communities would gather in circles instead of hierarchies, resolving challenges through dialogue and collective wisdom rather than authority imposed from above. Music, art, and storytelling would infuse daily life, not as entertainment to numb exhaustion, but as expressions of the soul woven into the fabric of existence. Even the cities, once monuments to speed and consumption, would soften into living ecosystems where green spaces, waterways, and gathering places replace concrete sprawl, and where technology serves as invisible support rather than dominating presence. The greatest change, however, would be inward. People would move through their days without the constant undertone of fear, anxiety, and scarcity that once haunted ever by choice, and in its place would be a quiet assurance, a felt sense of belonging both to one another and to the earth herself. Life would not be perfect, for challenges would still arise, but those challenges would be met with the strength of remembrance, with the knowledge that no force outside can sever the bond between the soul, the community, and the cosmos. On a healed earth, governance and leadership would no longer resemble the rigid hierarchies and manipulative structures that once defined the age of the hidden families, for the very notion of centralized authority built upon coercion would dissolve, replaced instead by fluid networks of stewardship where responsibility is shared and leadership emerges organically rather than imposed from above. Councils would form not out of ambition or competition, but out of service, with individuals stepping forward when their wisdom or skill is most needed, and then stepping back when the task is complete, allowing leadership to be a rotating current rather than a permanent throne. Decisions would not be dictated by distant elites or faceless bureaucracies, but would rise from the ground up, rooted in the voices of communities who live in direct relationship with the land and the resources they tend, ensuring that the choices affecting rivers, forests, or farms are made by those who walk among them daily. Technology would support this decentralized model, not through surveillance or control, but by weaving together networks of transparency, allowing every person to witness the flow of resources, energy, and agreements, making corruption impossible because secrecy itself would lose its power. Justice would shift from punishment to restoration, with conflicts approached as opportunities for healing rather than retribution, guided by elders, mediators, and community circles who recognize that harm arises from disconnection and is resolved through reconnection. The very language of governance would change, with words like ruler, subject, law, and order, giving way to terms like stewardship, balance, covenant, and harmony. Leadership would cease to be an avenue for power and become instead a burden willingly carried by those strong enough to serve, respected not for authority, but for humility, and honored not with wealth or privilege, but with gratitude. In this way, governance would no longer stand apart from daily life, but would be woven seamlessly into the fabric of community, just as rivers guide landscapes without ruling them, ensuring that humanity never again mistakes domination for guidance or control for care. In this new era, spirituality and the sense of the sacred would no longer be confined to rigid dogmas, distant hierarchies, or the manipulations of hidden families who once used ritual as a tool of control. For the awakening would restore the understanding that the sacred is not owned by any institution, but flows through all of life. The temples of the future would not be monuments of stone, but the forests, oceans, mountains, and skies themselves, where people gather in reverence, not because they are commanded, but because awe arises naturally when the veil of forgetting is lifted. Spiritual practice would be woven seamlessly into daily life, no longer divided into sacred and profane, for each breath, each meal, each act of creation would be recognized as a dialogue with the infinite. Teachers and guides would not sit on thrones or declare themselves intermediaries to the divine, but would walk alongside others as mirrors, reminding them of the truth already within. For the essence of remembrance is that no one can own or gatekeep the spark of creation. Music, Art and story would again serve as vessels of the sacred, not entertainment for distraction, but living channels through which the unseen communicates with the seen, carrying wisdom across generations without the need for scripture carved in stone. Spiritual gatherings would be diverse, reflecting the infinite expressions of the divine, yet united by a shared recognition that all paths lead back to the same source, that the multiplicity of symbols and practices are like facets of a single jewel. The manipulation of fear, eternal damnation, chosen elites, blood sacrifice, would fade into memory as relics of the age of control, and in their place would rise a spirituality rooted in joy, in freedom, in communion with the living earth and the wider cosmos. In this way, the sacred would cease to be something people sow out in rare moments, and instead become the atmosphere in which life itself unfolds, ensuring that never again could power be extracted by those who would use the name of the divine to enslave. In this renewed world, art, music, and story would blossom as the central expressions of the sacred, for they are the oldest languages of the soul and the most enduring vessels of memory, capable of carrying truths that no doctrine or law could ever contain. Song would no longer be reduced to mere entertainment or background noise, but would rise again as invocation, a weaving of voices that binds community together, heals wounds, and opens gateways between the seen and the unseen. Instruments would be played not to impress or compete, but to commune, their tones resonating with the rhythms of earth and the harmonics of the cosmos, reminding all who listen that they are part of a greater symphony of life. Storytelling would return to its ancient role as the living archive of humanity, not simply recounting events, but encoding wisdom in myth and symbol, ensuring that the lessons of both forgetting and remembrance remain alive across generations. Painters, sculptors, dancers, and poets would cease to be marginalized as eccentric or impractical, for their work would be recognized as essential medicine, expressions that awaken memory and anchor the invisible into form. Festivals would emerge as central rituals of the new culture, not as spectacles of consumption, but as celebrations of co-creation, where communities gather to share food, song, and stories under the open sky, rekindling the primal joy of being together in beauty. Even the technologies once used to numb and distract would be reimagined as tools of amplification, allowing music, vision, and narrative to travel instantly across the globe, weaving humanity into a single resonant fabric without erasing the unique colors of each culture. In this way, art would no longer be separated from life or confined to galleries and stages, but would become inseparable from existence itself, reminding every person that to create is to pray, to sing is to heal, and to tell a story is to remember. In the awakened era, relationships and love would transform into expressions of freedom rather than arrangements bound by fear, control, or possession, for the memory of what it means to truly see and honor another would return to the heart of human connection. Partnerships would no longer be forged out of survival, dependency, or the cultural scripts of obligation, but from resonance, the recognition of two beings walking alongside each other in alignment while retaining their own sovereignty. Love would not be measured by ownership, jealousy, or sacrifice of self, but by the ability to celebrate the other's growth, to witness their becoming without attempting to mold them into an image of control. Families would be reimagined not as rigid structures, but as living constellations of care, formed by choice as much as by blood, where children are raised not as possessions of parents, but as sovereign souls entrusted temporarily to their guidance. Friendships would deepen beyond convenience or utility, becoming sacred mirrors where truth can be spoken freely without fear of rejection. For in a culture rooted in remembrance, vulnerability would no longer be weakness, but the bridge of genuine connection. Even intimacy would be healed, freed from centuries of distortion and shame, rediscovered as a sacred act of union not only between bodies, but between spirits, where desire is not tainted by domination or secrecy, but honored as an expression of life's creative current. Love itself would expand beyond the personal into the collective, radiating outward into communities, ecosystems, and the wider cosmos. For once the illusion of separation dissolves, it becomes impossible to confine love to the narrow corridors of exclusivity. In this way, relationships would no longer be cages or contracts, but living, breathing journeys of mutual evolution, each one a reminder that true love is not about binding another to you, but about walking together in freedom, side by side, toward the infinite.